Jim Sullivan, known to his friends and family as Sully, was an imaginative, artistic, and creatively driven rock and roll musician. His surreal exploratory lyricism and underlying love for the essence of American folk music were cut short by an unexplainable, untraceable vanished in March of 1975, leaving all who knew him and the future fans of his work grasping for answers. As a hope to provide more substantial reasoning built upon observable evidence and situational analysis, this is an examination of the disappearance of Sullivan and the mystery at La Mesa Motel in the deserts of New Mexico. Jim Sullivan was born on August 13, 1940, in the Linda Vista area near San Diego, California. His parents, two Irish-American farmers who left Nebraska after the height of the Dust Bowl in the late 1930s, moved to Southern California for employment in the defense industry. Jim once wrote about his youth in liner notes on his first LP, saying he grew up in a government housing project with a bunch of other oats and Arkies. These experiences helped inspire his fascination with American folk culture, and after frequently listening to local blues groups in the area, Jim decided to dip his toes into the music scene as well. As he entered his teenage years, Jim became quite the athlete, standing at about 6 feet 3 inches in high school. While playing quarterback for his high school football team, he never missed a chance to rock out on his Sears Silvertone guitar and amplifier, the perfect combo for an upcoming 16-year-old rock and roller. Jim, favoring the nickname Sully amongst his friends, never failed to spark a connection within social circles and met his future wife, Barbara, in junior high. After finishing school together, Barbara and Jim married not long before Jim joined a classic rock band called The Survivors, a staple in the San Diego music scene fronted by Jim's sister-in-law, Kathy Dorham. Jim and Barbara had their first son together, Chris. When he was 7 years old, the flourishing family moved up to Los Angeles to continue pursuing music and expand their promising horizon. Soon after, Barbara received a job at Capitol Records in Hollywood, while Jim dedicated his free time to fine-tuning his guitar skills and making connections within the entertainment industry. He began playing at more prominent establishments around the area, such as the Lighthouse and Lindy Opera House. Jim's true hotspot was in Malibu, however, at a celebrity-filled pub called The Raft, where he forged relationships with fellow artists like Farrah Fawcett, Lee Marvin, and Harry Dean Stanton. By 1969, Jim's friends convinced him to record an album and helped him raise the appropriate funding to produce such a project. This first album turned out to be his recording debut, a folk rock endeavor titled UFO, with lyrics originating from spiritual and mystical ideas believed in by Jim. The recording process included 20 other musicians who contributed to a truly ethereal sound in addition to its country music roots. Not being much of a promoter himself, Jim let his indie record label, Money Records, advertise UFO. The word circulated through a few unknown music circles and was rumored to be a topic out in Nashville, where Johnny Cash's manager was thought to be an interested party. Even Jim's wife Barbara attempted to use her connection at Capitol Records to secure a big name like Beach Boys producer Nick Vaney to pick up Jim as an artist, but no one took the bait. Unfortunately, the album never caught fire despite Jim and his friends' enthusiasm, and UFO was left for a small reissue at the Century City label. 2 years later, Jim threw together additional resources to release a second album, this time a self-titled project called Jim Sullivan through Playboy Records, completely unrelated to the Playboy brand. Again, the album gained little traction, theorized to be the result of heavy production values that covered up the clever lyrics written by Jim. In the end, after the two projects were a relative failure, Jim and his wife Barbara struggled to get back on their feet at full force and turned to alcohol, where their marriage began to crumble as their careers dwindled into darkness. Years passed before Jim decided that his time in Los Angeles was nearing a stalemate and decided to relocate his musical endeavors to Nashville, Tennessee, where his former bandmate and sister Kathy Dorham resided. Jim packed up his belongings in his old Volkswagen Bug and told family to wait and see if he made it big before coming with him. He didn't hesitate and drove out east, making it as far as Santa Rosa, New Mexico, before getting pulled over by hotel, called his wife from a nearby payphone, and bought a handle of liquor at a local store. What preceded is unknown because later that night, Jim Sullivan was last seen walking into the New Mexico desert away from civilization into the dusty abyss, only to vanish and never be heard from again. Jim Sullivan's journey truly began in 1968. He uprooted his family from the perfectly weathered San Diego, California, to the heart of the entertainment industry's playground, Los Angeles. He, Barbara, and Chris left to engage with the world of rock and roll and dedicated his life to his craft, a true love with music and mysticism. From 1968 to the early part of 1970, the Sullivan family made a name for themselves. Barbara secured employment at the legendary Capitol Records in Hollywood, while Jim shared his talents with the rest of Southern California. Jim linked up with movie stars and fellow musicians, combining a natural gravitas with pure artistic skill. He made many friends and frequently played at packed houses at the Raft Pub near Malibu. In 1969, Jim's album titled UFO was released to a bit of critical acclaim, and all signs pointed to stardom for the folk musician and his family. However, as the dog days of 1970 came and went, Jim's lyrical prowess lost its luster with the music heavyweight, and he turned to smaller record labels to produce another album. Sadly, the borderline experimental soundtrack never took off like he hoped, and Jim was left to return to playing in the dimly lit clubs he once gained his footing in. Following the track marks of failure and losing the glimmer of success that Hollywood once brought upon the Sullivan family, both Jim and Barbara turned to alcohol. And between 1972 and 1974, they saw their once sturdy marriage begin to crumble. In the late winter month of 1975, Jim decided to go against the grain and move out east to Nashville, Tennessee, in hopes to restart his career as a musician in a prominent folk and country music hotspot. Jim and Barbara discussed the family aspect of the proposed transition, and they agreed that she and their son Chris would wait to see if Jim captured success before joining him on the cross-country relocation. On the morning of March 4, 1975, Jim packed personal belongings into his old Volkswagen Bug and said goodbye to the town he once dreamed of sparking stardom. Between noon and 1 p.m. later that day, Jim physically departed from his family in Los Angeles, hopped on the National Highway, and headed east on Route 66. 15 long and lonely hours of driving passed by before Jim was pulled over by police for unintentionally swerving around the road outside of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, in the wee hours of March 5th, sometime around 3 or 4 a.m. After the traffic stop, Jim was taken into the Santa Rosa police station to take a sobriety test. He proved he had no alcohol or illicit substances in his system and passed the exam. The officers determined Jim was suffering from fatigue after his taxing drive across 900 miles and 3 state lines, and they recommended he find lodging to rest. Later that morning, Jim checked into La Mesa Hotel right off of Route 66 in Santa Rosa. However, he didn't unload any of his belongings, and at some point during the day, he left the room key locked inside the room. An undetermined amount of time passed, and Jim walked to the nearest liquor store and bought a handle of vodka. It's unknown if he immediately consumed the alcohol, but he was then soon witnessed getting back into his Volkswagen and driving around the Santa Rosa area. In the afternoon of March 5th, Jim drives out to a ranch about 26 miles southeast of Santa Rosa, a piece of land reportedly owned and lived on by the Gennady family. It's unclear what exactly happened at the Seti Ranch out in the middle of nowhere. However, it's been reported that Jim drove up to the nearby road where an older Italian woman who spoke little English met him with some ranch hands. When she asked him if he had a problem, Jim replied, "No to you." Other reports mentioned Jim driving all the way up to the ranch house and knocking on the door, much to the confusion of Mrs. Kennedy. Regardless of what exactly conspired, Jim leaves his vehicle behind on the ranch that evening of March 5th, 1975, and walks off the property towards the endless desert. This is the last confirmed sighting of Jim Sullivan. In the next couple of days following March 5th, after Jim's communication ceases, his disappearance is investigated by Santa Rosa authorities. Trace his final steps around town, ending at the Gennady family ranch. They find his Volkswagen Bug off on the side with the doors locked and the engine completely dead. Inside are Jim's personal artifacts, including his wallet, his guitar, and a bunch of old musical gear and personal audio tapes. Nobody on the property knew where Jim wandered off to, only that he was seen walking away from the vehicle. A road worker who had been laboring near the vanishing site that day, a man named Sammy Chavez, later recalled seeing the Volkswagen sitting in the middle of a dirt boat. He says it was quite a strange sight, and when he headed back the other way after his shift, all of the doors on the bug had been opened where police were searching. On March the 8th, the Volkswagen is towed away from the Gennady family ranch and presumably taken into custody. However, what happens to the Volkswagen bug is still unknown to this day. In the preceding 2 weeks of the investigation, countless law enforcement officials searched the nearby New Mexico desert for any sign of Jim, including the New Mexico State Police, the Santa Rosa Police, and multiple volunteer chains. The Sullivan family quickly makes their way to Santa Rosa to aid the search as well. News stations and publications all around write stories and release missing person notices to help spread awareness. However, no leads come to fruition. Around the same time that the Jim Sullivan disappearance is investigated by local and state police, the sheriff of Santa Rosa retires while the Gennady family moves to Hawaii. Neither the sheriff nor the Gennadys would ever be interviewed or questioned after those events. At the end of March, investigators discover a badly decomposing body 8 miles west of Las Cruces, a New Mexico town, almost 250 miles away from Santa Rosa. The body in question does have a striking resemblance to Jim despite the version and is initially thought to be his corpse. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, a local newspaper headlines reports that the body was indeed not Jim Sullivan and that no other leads were available at the time. 40 years later, not a shred of ever or trace leading to Jim is found by either professional investigators or amateur sleuths. In 2010, a music producer named Sullivan with no relation to Jim from Light in the Attic Records heard about Jim's puzzling legend and set out to find answers. While he was able to talk to some people who vaguely knew Jim from his days in Los Angeles, he was unable to crack the case of his disappearance. Although Matt was able to remaster Jim's rock and roll albums, resetting UFO as a cult classic, and prized piece of art amongst fans who were equally as mystified by Jim Sullivan's disappearance as we are today. In the spellbinding case of Jim's disappearance, many useful clues were unearthed. There were no security cameras at La Mesa Hotel or official records of Jim interacting with anybody specific either in town or at the ranch. There was no blood, no goodbye letter, and no footprints. However, investigators did find something of suspicion a few weeks into their manhunt. A major discovery that was thought to be the resolution: a decomposed body of a middle-aged man found abandoned in New Mexico desert. The body in question had multiple similarities at Jim. The corpse was of a man appearing to be in his 30s or 40s, standing at about 6 feet 2 inches. Both the body and Jim weighed about 180 pounds and sported a tattoo on their right forearms. They each had a mustache and a rough short beard when this revelation was first announced through the New Mexico media. Journalists and citizens alike were convinced it was the body of Jim Sullivan. Unfortunately, their certainty was short-lived when the same news outlets reported the body was that of someone else, meaning Jim was most likely still lost out in the world. There are a few curious details about this case point that don't add up. First and foremost, no official police announced regarding the body or its identity was ever released to the public. Thus, neither the people at the time nor people now know exactly whose body was discovered that spring. The fact that both Jim and the corpse were of similar builds didn't raise any red flags, but taking into consideration the similar facial hair and tattoo were of the same length and location is borderline inconceivable. It raises many questions, biggest of which is if Jim's family ever identified the body. All the news reports stated was the body was later proved not to be that of Sullivan, but there's no official medical announcement or law enforcement comment on the matter. Sadly, DNA forensics weren't in the picture back in 1975 and wouldn't have been available to correctly ID the John Doe. Another difficult detail to comprehend is the land where police found the unidentified corpse. The body was in the desert outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico, the second largest city of the state found in the Mississippi Valley. Mysteriously, Las Cruces is seated near the southern border of New Mexico, almost 250 miles away from Santa Rosa. So even if there was an identification error and the body was truly that of Jim, it would mean he had somehow traveled 250 miles by foot across barren desert in a different direction than where he was last seen and died quickly enough that his body would be decomposed past easy recognition. Neither this scenario adds up, making the corpse case point a catch-22 and offering quite a few foundations to endless theories regarding Jim's disappearance. Clouds of mystery have surrounded Jim Sullivan since that clear sunny evening on March the 5th without eyewitness testimony or hard evidence. The number of potential endings to Jim's story is vast if this truly is an ending at all. However, there are a few with interesting ties to his friends found in short-lived history in Santa Rosa involving links to police corruption, the Chicago Mafia, supernatural abduction, and even a staged farewell. First and foremost, we must consider the role of local law enforcement during Jim's time in Santa Rosa. It's possible that when Jim arrived in the small New Mexico town, he managed to upset authorities by either something he said or by seeing something he shouldn't have witnessed. It's been confirmed that Jim had at least one point of contact with a police officer outside of city limits when he was swerving across the road and was taken into the station for gold testing. The only piece of information known regarding what happened inside of the police department, however, is that Jim passed the alcohol test and was released. Whether or not Jim was forced inside or harassed during his stay is unknown, but certainly possible. Jim was a larger man, and while he was always regarded as a calm and collected individual, authorities could have seen him as a stranger to the area and treated him as a threat. Or maybe Jim was upset with the entire ordeal and caused a scene either at the traffic stop or during his test. Regardless, without knowing what truly happened with the officers, it's impossible to rule out a situation escalating into chaos. So if Jim had made himself an enemy with local authorities, it's likely the police were called when Jim traveled to the Gennady family ranch with a handle of vodka. Jim could have been drunk and in a bad mood from the previous encounter, and trespassing on private property as an unknown figure could have caused Mrs. Kennedy to phone the police. When the police arrived and saw it was Jim once again, they could have taken action into their own hands. It's possible they let him go off on his own into the desert and waited until he was gone to pick him back up. On the other hand, it's also possible the police never interacted with him a second time, instead finding him dead in the desert after the fact and, instead of investigating the cause of death, moved his corpse out of Santa Rosa and ignored the situation. This would give an explanation as to why the John Doe corpse looked so similar to Jim's appearance yet was discovered 250 miles away from his last sighting. These police hamperings would also explain another peculiar and disturbing anomaly recently found in the case. NamUs, or the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, is a database of all the people who have vanished or died without an identity. It covers the entire United States as a brilliant tool in keeping track of DNA, police records, and real-time updates. However, missing from the NamUs database is Jim Sullivan. While it's not exactly a major surprise seeing as though this case is 40 years cold, it did motivate John Morden to look into the era. But what Morden found is the most interesting fact of all. There is no official missing persons case filed in New Mexico, either by state police or by Santa Rosa law enforcement. There are no mentions of the case in police archives and no departmental documentation about a search for Jim Sullivan, either in 1975 or otherwise. Now, while this can simply be explained by the possibility that Barbara or any other member of the Sullivan family never filed an actual missing persons report, the fact of the matter is, besides newspaper articles, there is no written communication providing a search existed. 45 years ago in a small community or not, zero police profiles are more suspicious than coincidental, hinting that local authorities may have had a piece of the pie in whatever crime or cover-up was committed. Not to mention the fact that the local Santa Rosa sheriff retired and moved away right after the investigation began. Another theory centers on the vague relevance of the family and their rumored connections to Chicago crime and mafia ties. A few citizens near the Santa Rosa area claimed the Gennady family had a history with illicit activities and were operating under direction from powerful people in a Chicago gang organization. Now, whether or not this was the actual dealings of an Italian mafia or just folklore turned into hyperbole is unknown. But with multiple claims that the Gennady family were known for bad behavior, it's not out of the realm of possibility that they dealt with Jim's arrival using illegal means. If Jim truly did trespass on the Gennady family ranch and disrespected Mrs. Gennady, it makes sense that another member of the family or one of their colleagues came around and took care of Jim, who could have been drunk and insubordinate. If they indeed killed Jim and had experience with that sort of thing, they knew how to dispose of a body and leave no trace, or they planted the body down in Las Cruces and paid off the proper authorities to sway public knowledge. Now, why an organized crime family would drop a body off in the same state and general area of the murder is nonsensical. So if the Gennady family truly is responsible, they are probably the only ones with knowledge regarding Jim's exact location and what happened in the first place. It's worth noting that none of these claims can be confirmed nor denied with observable proof that Jim even made contact with the family. However, it should also be stated that the Gennadys packed up and left New Mexico and moved to Hawaii at the same time the Santa Rosa sheriff retired. Just as the hunt for Jim and relevant clues heated up, the last theory stemming from homicidal origins is that Jim was actually running away from trouble stirred up in Los Angeles and got caught before he could escape. Jim became a socialite in LA, meeting many celebrities and fellow musicians as he performed at various clubs. One of his favorite places was the Raft, now called the Real Inn, where he played with the cream of the crop. He might have, somewhere down the line, fixed in with the wrong group of people at the Raft or a similar joint, got desperate for money, and was unable to pay off his debts when his scheme reached a dead end. That he packed up everything, asked his family to stay put, and made a run for it only to be caught up in the end. It would explain why he was so set on driving 15 hours and then, on the first day of his journey, pushed himself past his mental limit. Maybe after spending time at the police station, he knew his followers were hot on the trail. So he attempted to find solace at a local residence and ended up at the Kennedy Ranch. When he was denied help, he knew it was the last straw, and his pursuers picked him up after a short chase. It would also explain why Jim booked a room at the motel but never settled in, signaling he was either trying to stage his farewell or throw his pursuers off their tracks. Unfortunately, running into them anyway. The biggest evidence against this theory is that it's been told through the years by many known associates of Jim and his family that Jim avoided conflict at all costs and was quite soft-spoken. However, it still does take into consideration his turn towards alcohol and the pitfalls of broken dreams. We have reached out to the current owner of the Real Inn to see if they had any connections to employees still around from the days of the Raft Pub and Jim's playing circuit. The owner, Andy Leonard, informed us of a former bartender, Ralph O'Hara, whose knowledge of the restaurant dated back to the 1950s. Sadly, upon further investigation, Ralph O'Hara passed away in 2015, leaving the pool of witnesses to Jim's alley life in short supply. One popular hypothesis revolving around Jim has led to his music reaching cult classic status, specifically his debut album titled UFO. With people believing Jim wandered into the New Mexico desert and encountered intelligent extraterrestrial life, and whether it was by his own free will or under abduction, left our planet with supernatural beings. These conspiracies draw inspection to Jim's music and the aforementioned UFO album, in which he uses surreal lyrics and experimental sound design to build his artistic style. The combination of a strange soundscape and mystical songwriting lead many to believe Jim had a deeper understanding of otherworldly themes and ideas. These highlights convince some circles that Jim left on his own accord, rather living with others out in the universe than with the turmoil of failure on Earth. And while the alien abduction conspiracy theory is often used yet aptly charged urban legend, Jim's own family doesn't rule out the possibility themselves, saying it would have been a fitting goodbye for Jim and his mystical philosophies. In reality, Jim's UFO album was more creative circumstance than actual extraterrestrial communication. The song titled after the album is actually just an existential metaphor describing a religious figure of alien and appears more like a coincidence than proof of interactions with intergalactic life forms. After analyzing all of the puzzle pieces of Jim Sullivan's disappearance and his life surrounding the events, it truly is almost impossible to decide on a solid conclusion to an endlessly confusing event. No theory can be ruled out with such little and conflicting testimonies from everyone involved, but one rarely discussed sequence sticks out a little more than the rest. We believe Jim fully intended to rekindle his music passion in Nashville when he left Los Angeles. But during his grueling 15-hour drive into New Mexico that ended with fatigue and external conflict, he turned back to the bottle and then, at a stop, walked out into the desert with the intention never to return again. It's important to remember what Jim's personal life was like in 1975. His marriage was on the brink, and two massive creative endeavors ended up as major flops, providing zero reward to the struggle and artist experiences while chasing their dreams in the City of Angels. Combined with the overall turmoil of American culture and the state of the world at the moment in time, anxieties and anguish most likely took over Jim's emotions as he battled with the shrouds of darkness circling his family and career. First, Jim packed up all his belongings and set himself on a trail of redemption. When he couldn't weather the long-haul journey anymore, he was stopped by the police and most likely stereotyped as an outsider. A tall, bulky man with a scraggly beard, another jacket. After dealing with the mild aggravation of law enforcement, Jim purchased alcohol, the only comfort he knew anymore. Feeling as if the journey was insurmountable, he most likely pondered what he would do next in his motel room. Eventually deciding to leave without notice, he locked his key in his room, drove out to a place where his car would be found, and the trace would end. Explaining the approximation to the Genetti Ranch, drunk and disorientated, Jim probably stumbled out into the desert, letting go of life behind him and submitting himself to the unknown and undeniable shadow of the deserted wilderness. What happened to Jim's body will most likely remain a mystery, but taking into consideration the landscape, whatever he left behind was scavenged by wild animals or buried by a third party after he was found dusty in his demise. The area around Santa Rosa is also known for its unusual number of lakes and bodies of water, potential grounds for which Jim could have wandered off to and drowned while drunk. Had he gotten far enough on foot, Jim could have also disappeared into the mountains, either dying in the hills or living off the land for a short while. It's unclear if the search efforts throughout the years included the myriad bodies of water, mountainous regions, and if they didn't, Jim's body could easily have decomposed. Many of those close to Jim claimed that he wouldn't have left on his own accord and not taken his guitar with him. However, if Jim was under the influence, his attachment to the instrument might never have crossed his mind. One of the most fascinating aspects of this conclusion is a statement made by Jim's former producer, Bob Ginter. Ginter said that one day, back during their rock and roll endeavors, in the early morning hours after a long night, the two men talked about what they would do if they had to disappear. Jim responded that he'd walk into the desert and never come back. It's easy to brush this statement off as coincidental, but even if it was just a subconscious desire, Jim had the thought to walk into the desert before he disappeared. When factoring in Jim's addiction to the substance that brought forth subconscious feelings, it makes sense that he reconnected to the past ideation after drinking, turning to the New Mexico wilderness when all was lost. One of his more famous songs from the UFO album titled Jerome included the following lyrics: "A more natural pose I cannot bear to see, and I hope that these people never visit me. It's my time to go. I just want the wind to blow my ashes until they're completely out of sight." Nevertheless, the story of Jim and the vanishing on March the 5th, 1975, has intrigued all who have discovered the enigma, either through his music or by chance. Some folks believe Jim could even still be alive. A woman by the name of Tracy Pierce worked at a foster home in Eugene, Springfield, Oregon, about 30 years ago, helping tend to patients who needed a place to stay and care for serious brain injuries. She states that one of her patients back in the day bore a striking resemblance to Jim. Tracy also said he caught beat up and left for dead in the desert. He crawled back to the road, and someone brought him to the hospital. He was paralyzed from the waist down, but would still get himself up every morning and get dressed out. I thought he said it was Nevada, but it was almost 30 years ago. He was a nice guy but kept to himself. We have reached out to Tracy for further comments, but have yet to hear back. Regardless, as we continue to search for clues in the case of Jim's disappearance, let's also remember his unparalleled style as a musician and his unforgettable unique talents in writing lyrics. With the right circumstances and a better support system, many believe Jim could have found beautiful success as a folk artist and taken off into stardom. His 2 albums were remastered by the Light in the Attic Records, and Matt Sullivan, a producer who has no relation to Jim but has published a few pieces about him and his legacy, can be found in many places around the internet. Take a listen and text to Jim as a brilliant soul, a symbol of daring dreams and special talents. Remember his friendly demeanor and positive spirit as he helped listeners around the country escape into worlds of melody and magic. The creativity and imagination will last forever. But hopefully, mysteries of Jim Sullivan, the Highwayman, are solved one day soon. Trevor Deely was an extremely jovial, neighborly, and technically gifted young man. His interest in computers and talents for mathematics were cut short by an unexplainable, untraceable vanishing in December of 2000, leaving all who knew him, both in life and through the World Wide Web, grasping for answers in a sea of evidence that drowned us all in doubt. As a hope to provide more substantial reasoning built upon visible evidence and situational analysis, this is an examination of the disappearance of Trevor Dean and the relation to a nearby shadowy figure. Trevor Dealey was born on August 15, 1978, in Nays, County Kildare, Arab Island to parents Michael and Ann Dealey. He was the youngest of 4 children who learned under the close tutelage of brother Mark and sisters Michelle and Pamela. His soft-spoken yet infectious childhood demeanor made him a likable kid, and even as a teenager, Trevor developed an even-tempered personality, getting along with basically anyone and everyone. His older siblings were all athletic in school, participating in sports and competitions. Trevor was the odd man out, however, and instead flourished as an athlete of the mind, finding a love for arithmetic and sciences. These interests in numbers and tech, combined with problem-solving tendencies, inspired Trevor to tinker with computers and audio-visual systems. It developed into a hobby for Trevor but never seemed like a viable career choice. He was confused about where to focus his studies after graduating high school, testing out the waters of business and economics at Waterford Institute of Technology. During this period, he worked part-time at the local supermarket but never felt truly comfortable and dropped out after the first semester, remembering that Trevor had a gift for troubleshooting. His sister Michelle recommended a series of computer lessons in Dublin. Trevor obliged and quickly discovered his calling in life. Michelle was quoted in the Irish Times saying about her brother's newfound talents, "He took it like a duck to water, like turning a key in a lock." Trevor loved the coursework and soon devoted all of his energy to computers. When he finished the schooling, he was immediately offered 3 separate job opportunities. Seeking professional advice, Trevor turned to his dad, who was also quoted in the Irish Times. "I said take the bank. Banks are safer than any of the other." This would turn out to be quite an unsettling foreshadow for the upcoming tragedy. 7 months before the turn of the millennium, Trevor took a position at Bank of Ireland Asset Management by Leeson Street Bridge in Dublin. He worked in the IT department in an office with 10 other employees who all raved about his work ethic and enthusiasm. Trevor's manager, Dara Tracy, described him as the perfect employee who was reliable on the job, hungry for knowledge, and friendly with everyone at the company. The same was true in his personal life, as Trevor became especially close with his elder brother, Mark, and his 2 lifelong last buddies, Glenn Collin and Conley Flannan. In addition, Trevor had met a girl in his last summer in Dublin and traveled up to Anchorage, Alaska to see her only a month before this mystery began. Despite the bevy of cheers and positive relationships in Trevor's life, an unexpected, unforeseen darkness was on the horizon. During the holiday season of December 2000, Trevor's co-workers set up a company Christmas party at the Hilton Hotel in Dublin. The night was full of drinking and good vibes until early the next morning. At about 4 a.m., CCTV footage captured Trevor walking from the Bank of Ireland office towards his apartment in Ballsbridge. And this would soon prove to be the last sighting of Trevor before his unable disappearance. In May of 1999, Trevor Dealey receives 3 job offers and decides to select an IT position at Bank of Ireland Asset Management on Wilton Terrace at the suggestion of his father. Trevor blends right into the working culture and forms healthy professional relationships with his peers. After the turn of the millennium, sometime in 2000, Trevor starts renting a flat on Serpentine Avenue, Sandymount, Dublin 4, in the Renoir complex. Along with him are 2 other female roommates, Neve and Sarah. The trio maintains a conflict-free living situation throughout the year. Later that summer, Trevor meets a girl named Karen, who is visiting Ireland on a vacation from Anchorage, Alaska. She is only in Dublin for a short while, but Trevor feels a romantic connection. None of Trevor's friends nor family get a chance to meet Karen. On the 7th of October in the same year, Mark Delia attends a GAA football match with Trevor in Castle Park, County Mayo. The brothers spend the day with a few additional friends, and Mark mentions it was at this moment that he saw Trevor as more than a sibling, but as a peer, mentioning Trevor showed promise in his own life with both work and finances. It's the closest memory in their relationship, but would also prove to be the last. Sometime in the last couple of weeks of November, Trevor and close friend Glenn Cullen have a conversation about Karen, the girl Trevor met in summertime. Glenn bets in passing that Trevor wouldn't go visit her in the States, to which Trevor retorts that he will. Nevertheless, he is soon added to Glenn's Aer Lingus discount beneficiaries list and accesses a free flight from Ireland to Anchorage, Alaska. After stopping in Los Angeles, Trevor arrives in Alaska, where he intends to meet up with Karen. However, this point in the timeline is quite muddied in terms of what actually happened in Anchorage. Trevor's father, Michael, claims Trevor had more than one girl of interest in the States that he had met in Ireland and claims that he found in Trevor's email a correspondence in which Trevor told one of the girls he was free for a few days and would come visit in person. The girl named Janie replied and said she would be busy during the specified date, yet Trevor persisted and still made the trip. On the flip side, Trevor's brother Mark was confident the vacation wasn't out of the ordinary and was nothing more than a spree of relaxation that included a reconnection with his ex-girlfriend, a completely harmless coincidence. On Tuesday, December the 5th, Trevor returns home from Alaska and hitches a bus back to the family home in Nace. His father only sees him in passing as he leaves for a work meeting. Meanwhile, an exhausted Trevor talks by the peace caps he witnessed. His mother encourages him to come home that weekend to tell them more about his recent trip, but Trevor said he plans to go Christmas shopping so wouldn't be able to. The next day, Wednesday, December 6th, Trevor goes back to work at Bank of Isle as normal. Sadly, abnormality strikes the very next day. At 4 p.m. on Thursday, December the 7th, Trevor finishes work. According to Michael Dealey, he received a call from Trevor that late afternoon, during which he mentioned his apartment complex electricity was this meant Trevor was at his flat sometime after work on the day he disappeared. Later in the early evening hours, Trevor also made aid to his father's office to pick up prescription contact lenses sent by his brother, who was an optician. However, Michael Dealey was out in meetings during this time. Soon after, Trevor and a few friends hit up the Copper-Faced Jack's nightclub where Trevor has the last known conversation with his father, Michael. About 8:45 p.m., Trevor and the crew leave the club and go to nearby Hilton Hotel in Charlemagne Place, where the actual company Christmas party is being held. They enjoy a fancy dinner and live music. A couple of hours later, sometime between 10 and 11:30 p.m., Trevor receives another phone call, this time from best friend Glenn Cullen. Unfortunately, it's too noisy on Trevor's end for any clear communication. The friends end up playing phone tag the remainder of the night. In the small hours of Friday morning, December the 8th, at about 2 a.m., Trevor and his friends leave the Hilton and arrive at Bug Whaley's on Leeson Street, another popular Dublin club. The post-party festivities last around an hour and a half until 3:35 a.m. Trevor is captured on CCTV footage in front of his office's gate number 2 at Wilton Terrace. He has a brief conversation with a curious man wearing all black before heading into the office by himself. He thanks the building security guard Peter for assisting him. It should be noted that the man wearing dark clothing has been seemingly waiting outside of Gate 1 for about 30 minutes prior to Trevor's arrival. At approximately 3:36 a.m., Trevor asks his coworker, Carl Pinder, if he's available for a quick cup of coffee. Carl says he's busy at the moment and asks Trevor to wait a minute or two. A minute later, at 3:37 a.m., further CCTV footage displays the same man in black standing outside of Gate 2, this time with a second figure positioned next to him and a possible third person covered by shadows behind them. 10 minutes later, at around 3:50 a.m., Trevor finally shares a beverage with Carl. The recreation is short-lived, however, as Trevor is seen exiting the office at 4:03 a.m. through Gate 2, now holding an umbrella on TV video evidence. 2 minutes pass before Trevor calls his friend Glenn one final time, saying he'll call again later that day. This would be the last official point of contact Trevor makes with anyone specific. At 4:14 a.m., additional surveillance footage reveals Trevor walking past what was then an AB bank on Harrington Road in the direction towards his Bullsbridge apartment. 30 seconds pass, and another passerby enters the frame, a man dressed in black, almost identical to the first shadowy figure from the Bank of Ireland's gateways. Other bystanders who were in the area at the time later recalled seeing nothing out of the ordinary. As he walks down the street out of view, it becomes the last known sighting of Trevor Dealey. At 9:30 a.m. the same morning, Trevor does not show up for work, and no action is taken. On multiple occasions over the weekend days of December the 9th and December the 10th, Trevor's sister Michelle makes several phone calls to Trevor, each time ringing, but ending up on voicemail. Michelle later remarks that she wasn't worried at the time and was pretty sure his cell phone was active each time. Suspicions finally arise on Monday, December the 11th, when Bank of Ireland informs Trevor's parents of his continued absence from work. Michael and Annie then tell their oldest son, Mark, who immediately feels a strange discomfort in the atmosphere and drives straight to the family home in Naas. Meanwhile, Michael goes to Trevor's apartment but receives no answer, either in person or on the phone. Mark continues the investigation efforts and searches both the Copper Face tracks night and the Ballsbridge area. When no traces are found, Mark accompanies the friend Glenn Cullen back to Naas and reports Trevor missing to the Naas Garda station. A major manhunt breaks out the next day on December the 12th as the Garda searches Trevor's flat, and a sub-aqua team combs the nearby Grand Canal. Both efforts draw a blank. The searches continue into January 2001, with flyers handed out to townsfolk and additional bodies of water inspected. Trevor's friend, Connor Lathlunan, even pitches in as a CCTV expert and researches partial footage from the night of his disappearance, but still no evidence is unearthed. Around February or March of 2015, 14 years after the mystery started, the Irish Times released a special 3-part series detailing the Trevor Daley case. Later in 2015, journalist Donald McIntyre creates an associated documentary that withholds a never-before-seen image of CCTV video outside the Bank of Ireland, unreleased by The Guardian. It highlights the second and third man cloaked in darkness that are outside the gate after Trevor exits the building, a fact unknown to the general public until this moment. In December 2016, investigators reignite Trevor's cold case with newfound CCTV footage and send it off for specialists in the UK to decipher the forensics of final moments. Just 4 months later, in April of 2017, a company in the United Kingdom concurs that the man in black followed Trevor by 30 seconds in the last CCTV shot. It's most likely the man in black outside of his office in the first few shots. These initial images are enhanced and reveal that Trevor did indeed speak to the shadowy figure before entering the Bank of Ireland on that fateful night, giving the public a new clue. This is the last accurate lead uncovered in the Trevor Daley file to date. Like all missing person cases and most criminal investigations in general, the most sought-after evidence is potential footage from the locations in which these crimes or mysteries occurred. In the search for Trevor Dean, one of his close friends, Conley Flunnen, was able to use his videotech expertise and procure partial CCTV footage from both the Bank of Ireland offices and the AAB offices mere days before they were to be destroyed. These tapes captured Trevor's last known moment in the early morning hours of December the 8th after he leaves the Christmas festivities to pick up an umbrella in his office and return home. It should be noted the footage jumps a couple of points, most likely for timekeeping concerns. The first part of the video displays a man dressed in dark clothing who arrives outside of the Bank of Ireland at 3:05 a.m. The footage then jumps to about 3:34 a.m., with the man still lingering about before exiting the frame to our left. It then shifts to a different angle, recording Trevor arriving at work at 3:35 a.m. At this moment, what is assumed to be the man in black pops back into the shot and talks to Trevor for a moment or two. Trevor then heads inside before the footage jumps again to 4:02 a.m., but we see Trevor walk back onto the street with his umbrella and the suspicious man nowhere to be seen. The final piece of tape then plays at 4:14 a.m., showing a man under an umbrella pass by the AIB building. This is later confirmed as Trevor Daley by his family. 30 seconds later, a man dressed in black walks in the same direction as Trevor. This figure is thought to be the man from earlier waiting around the two gateways and the man who spoke briefly with Trevor. To this day, he has never come forward to be eliminated from the inquiry, and until he does, he is still very much a suspect. Yet the mystery of this man and the CCTV footage, in general, does not stop there. After the tapes were digitally remastered, documentarian Donald McIntyre released a film in 2015 called Unsolved, in which he revealed screenshots of unreleased footage depicting Trevor and the man in black outside of Gate 2 after Trevor had left. However, a closer inspection in 2017 uncovered that the time code on this new screenshot is actually from the time period in between Trevor entering and exiting Bank of Ireland. Thus, neither this man on our right side nor the man standing in the back are Trevor himself. Rather, these are two new separate figures who appear to be looking into the office complex. Knowing this information, the image becomes much more unsettling as these men are hidden behind their dark clothing and shadows. When authorities reopened the case, they were able to track down the men on the right and in the back. These two individuals were cleared as co-workers of Trevor and quickly crossed off the list of suspects. However, why they were there at the offices at the same time that evening standing in the frame like they were is still unknown, leaving the entire CCTV case point in a shroud of doubt. Trevor DeLise's disappearance occurred just over 18 years ago, yet with almost 2 full decades of sleuthing, both professionals and amateurs have come up empty-handed, failing to secure hard evidence or expose the truth beyond coincidental and circumstantial assumptions. Despite the inconclusiveness of it all, there are a few notions that make sense when peeling back the layers of this case. First and foremost, many followers of the disappearance immediately point to Trevor's unquestionable trip to Alaska less than a week before his disappearance. To make such a long journey a third of the way across the world for a girl he briefly knew makes little sense. Alaska is a 9-hour flight that spans 9 time zones and offers little tourist value for a basic short-term visit. So if the vacation was truly meant to rekindle a romantic spark, it was quite an extreme gesture considering Trevor only mentioned the girlfriend aspect of it in passing, mostly to his friends. Glenn Cullen remarked that he'd only heard of Trevor's love interest by word of mouth and never saw pictures of her or proof that she existed. The only possible physical identification was seen by Trevor's father through the email chain previously mentioned. However, the woman in the communication was called Janie, not Karen. And whether they were the same person or completely separate has not been clarified by investigating, nor has confirmation that a search was done of the email correspondence discovered by Michael between Trevor and Janie. The general consensus now is that there was no girl, and that the stories about meeting college students from Anchorage were a cover-up for some other type of business or personal quest. Rural Alaska is a mystery in and of itself, and the number of potential activities kept a secret is too vast to go through. But it could include any number of operations such as money laundering, drug trafficking, or gang violence. How Trevor could ever be connected to such vices is both unknown and unlikely, but his expertise with computers and mathematics make him a useful person for any of these activities. In rebuttal, there is little likelihood that Trevor was able to keep such multinational offenses under wraps from everyone and leave behind no traces. While he was proficient with computer systems, he had no history or record associating him with virtual crimes. He was an outgoing, friendly individual, and pursuing a woman he liked isn't unusual for a man of his age, especially considering the tickets were free. Mark Dealey said in the Irish Times article that the trip to Anchorage was like any young adult attempting to find paradise, and Alaska was just a colder version of hotspots like Ibiza or Lanzarote. Trevor did seem flattered by the grand surroundings of Alaska ice caps in his short time spent with his mother after he returned, which is probably a genuine emotion rather than a cover for illicit activity. In the end, both TD family and investigators classified the Alaska trip as a red herring in the case. After both parties interrogated the girl in question and no leads were produced, another popular hypothesis believes Trevor was killed on his way home to his apartment by a ruthless Kremlin-based criminal, anonymous to everyone but to Garda officials. This theory originated from a tip given to Garda by an informant who claimed that Trevor had a run-in with a crumbling criminal who was shot and murdered before being dumped in a wooded area in West Dublin. The crumbling criminal had also been investigated for the unsolved murder of Sidney Kelly in June 1996. The criminal in question was never publicly identified due to legal reasons. Investigators said the informant himself had no motive for the crime, but didn't hold any serious weight with the tip despite the fact that the crumbling criminal's gangs were running a drug and prostitution trade in the surrounding area of Trevor's disappearance at the time he was last seen. Nevertheless, Garda eventually took this information under consideration and dug up a 3-acre forest in the Chapelized area to look for Trevor's remains. The secret crumbling criminal was eventually cleared after the informant's information was proven wrong, and no traces of Trevor were found in the excavation. Other theories focus on the man in black from CCTV footage, offering a flurry of ideas that he could be a modernized version of the Men in Black conspiracy and was at the offices that night to talk to Trevor about something supernatural he had witnessed, possibly during his time in Alaska. It would explain Trevor's subtle yet repeated fascination with the Alaska atmosphere and why the Man in Black followed Trevor home. If the Man in Black did kidnap Trevor, it might back up the complete lack of physical DNA or evidence left behind. It should be noted that the Dealey family has heavily denounced this line of thought and does not consider it tangible. In more realistic terms, followers of the case have suggested Trevor was kidnapped and murdered by the crumbling gang that morning. But instead of being buried, he was thrown into a body of water. Guardian officials have combed through countless rivers, ponds, and canals around the Dublin area and again have found no clues related to Trevor. It's also peculiar that Trevor's sister, Michelle, called her brother's cell phone over the course of the weekend, in which Trevor was unknown to be missing, and the caller emitted a series of rings rather than go straight to voicemail. This hints that the cell phone died before it was potentially destroyed and either Trevor or his kidnapper had access to it for up to 48 hours past 4:15 a.m. on December 8, 2000. A case like Trevor's, with infinite pathways but zero destinations, is incredibly difficult to conclude. However, there are just enough holes in the profile to poke through with calculated observations. These anomalies, combined with the CCTV, lead us to believe that Trevor knew something he shouldn't have, was followed by people he shouldn't have known, and he realized it and was eventually taken away against his will. What exactly this information was or who exactly the people it was connected to is impossible to crack. But without a doubt, it probably centered around illegal practices of a criminal nature. It was the type of forbidden knowledge that led to him being hunted down, kidnapped, and murdered. The first big piece of this conclusion is the conflicting information given by Trevor himself. Specifically, the two-faced schedule he gave to both his parents and his friends. After returning from Alaska, he told his parents he wouldn't be coming back home to Nace the following weekend so that he could finish some Christmas shopping. At the time, he made plans with friends Glenn and Conliffe to get drinks that weekend at Thomas Fletcher's Pub, a local bar in his hometown, while it could have been an honest mistake or intentional to avoid talking to his parents about Alaska. It kind of feels like Trevor wasn't telling the truth to either party. He might have had his own agenda over the weekend, maybe to take care of the issue at hand, and led both his friends and families astray. In fact, his absence at the pub was regarded as a normal occurrence by Glenn and Conliffe, as neither felt worried or even bothered to contact Trevor when he never showed up for drinks. In addition, Trevor displayed a few moments of subtle nervous behavior after his return from Alaska besides mismanaging the information he gave up about his weekend plans. Trevor's actions the hours before his disappearance strike us as odd. For example, when Trevor walks up to Gate 2 at Bank of Ireland and speaks to the black cloth man, he spends little time engaging with him and enters the building soaking wet, seemingly in a hurry to get home. However, instead of grabbing the umbrella and departing, Trevor asked the night shift employee, Carl Pinder, to share a cup of tea. When Carl asked for a few moments to finish his task, Trevor didn't leave. Instead, he logged onto his computer and performed unknown actions as if waiting for something to happen and pass the time. Then, when Carl was available, the two shared hot beverages and converged about nothing in particular for 10 minutes before Trevor finally left. This entire exchange is very odd. We typically don't spark up conversations with a colleague at work on a Friday night at almost 4 in the morning. And when you find they are busy, why get on the computer and mess around as if it's a dire meeting? Only to chit-chat aimlessly for a few minutes. What did he do on the computer, and what did he and Carl discuss? Carl does not remember the details but is certain it was not an immersion or dire conversation, and that Trevor was also in a stable mindset and not drunk like people assume after the evening of drinks and parties. The entire 25-minute episode seemed as if Trevor had something bothering him, most likely stemming from the sudden appearance of the Man in Black outside waiting for him. There are also a few pieces of the puzzle that were either ignored or poorly investigated altogether, with very little information being released by officials afterwards. First, the electricity being out at Trevor's apartment complex on the day he disappeared feels more than coincidental. He called in maintenance to fix the issue earlier in the day, and it seems that they did by the time he arrives home from work. But why or how the flat's lost electricity is never explained and possibly never investigated in the first place. It would be fascinating to hear from other people living in the complex at that time, to hear if they remember the power going out or if they saw any suspicious figures hanging around the building's electrical panel in the days prior. Not only that, but the apartment, in general, was never completely ruled out as being the last place Trevor visited. Garda officials believed he never went home that night, but we have no recorded information about the state of Trevor's flat and if there were signs of a struggle, an intentional leave, or DNA forensics. Secondly, Garda claimed they searched Trevor's computer and email for any evidence and came up empty-handed. However, analyzing audiovisual systems was not as thorough in the year 2000 as it is today, and another debrief of Trevor's internet history could prove useful if released to the public. Trevor was a technical mastermind anyway, so it is possible he hid any secrets out of reach of the local government's shoddy computer searches. Third, it's infuriating to think police let Trevor's last known bit of communication get deleted without second thoughts. Trevor was confirmed to have called his friend Glenn at 4:05 a.m., and according to Glenn, left a voicemail that said little besides that he'd call again soon to talk and catch up on recent events. Investigators thought this to be a routine message, and after Glenn agreed there was nothing out of the ordinary to his ears, Garda allowed Glenn to delete the message. This is gross negligence by police in missing person cases. Any bit of communication left by the victim needs to be preserved. Even if it was a 5-second hello and goodbye, you never know what could be extracted from the background. Every piece of evidence deserves its due diligence and to be put under a microscope. Finally, we must address the two supposed colleagues of Trevor who appear in the newly released CCTV footage screenshots. Authorities were quick to identify the man on the right and the man in the back as co-workers, but never shared any details beyond this fact, other than that they were cleared of any wrongdoing. So who were they exactly? What are their names? What are they also doing at work at 3:40 in the morning? Did they accompany Trevor from the Christmas party back to work to make sure he arrived safely? If so, why do they stand so strangely in the frame, positioned in a bizarre manner as if they are waiting and looking at Trevor with a bit of shadowy intimidation? And if they were waiting, why did they leave prematurely? Did they know the first man? Did they confront him, or are they able to identify the mysterious figure? It's mind-boggling to think that they were ruled out despite appearing in the most mysterious question-peddling piece of evidence, which is missing critical segments in the first place. When do the second and third subjects leave? Where does the first man go? Do they converse? This footage is sadly unavailable and can be destroyed from the time of origin. It's quite possible that the two colleagues were interviewed and provided alibis and explanations. But without documented proof, it's hard to accept such leniency. In the end, taking into consideration the full CCTV tapes and its role in the case, we believe the Black Cloth Man wasn't alone, and there were multiple people following Trevor since his return from Alaska. This suspicious man from the footage was assigned to wait outside of the bank and asked Trevor if they could talk before he went inside. Trevor probably denied this request as it was late and he had been drinking and then purposefully stalled inside the office with Carl. Meanwhile, Trevor's fellow colleagues had stopped by to check on his well-being. And when the man in black told him Trevor had gone inside for a while, the co-workers decided to leave not long thereafter. Trevor then came back outside to an abandoned gate too and went about his business, ignorant of the Black Cloth Man following behind him discreetly. This man or his potential accomplices confronted Trevor again at his flat since his roommates were away on holiday. There were probably other people with the man back at the apartment as backers and were probably responsible for the electrical outage at the complex. When Trevor insisted his innocence, the man realized it was too late for such a plea and Trevor had to go before he revealed what he possibly knew. Trevor was then kidnapped, kept alive for a period of time before homicide, and eventually disposed of in a place where he wouldn't be recovered, probably out of the country or in the surrounding area. Like all unsolved cases, Trevor Dealey's is truly one left up in the air. This conclusion takes into account all of the investigations, strengths, and weaknesses, and attempts to build the most likely if not fully conclusive answer. Since the restored CCTV footage was released in 2015, and the false alarm search at the chapel's Artwoods, no new leads have been unearthed. However, Guardian officials did release a statement in December of 2018 that they would be going back to unidentified human remains still in storage to utilize breakthrough DNA technology and test the pieces for any trace of Trevor. If anything, it provides a newfound hope for the Dealey family, who have over the years refused to consider conspiracies and simply asked that Trevor's fate be solved. Whether that means a body or not, they just want something concrete. Sister Michelle Dealey was quoted in the Irish Times, saying, "I don't believe people vanish. It makes no sense to me. It actually starts to hurt your brain when you think about it." She, along with her parents, her siblings, and Trevor's friends, just wants closure in the 18 years and continuing of nightmares to end. It's regular people like us who can tackle these terrors and help fight the growing number of missing person cases. We wouldn't report this if we didn't think it could help remind the world, spread awareness, and potentially help bring a new clue or lead to the forefront of the search. It's important not to forget that before this case froze, he was a human being, a man with a future in technology, community, teamwork, and resourcefulness. He was infectiously friendly with a positive attitude that stuck with his peers with a force of good. His dedication to problem-solving and compassion impacted countless lives, and we hope that the impact continues to exert influences again soon. Until then, the search continues as we push for clarity and fight for answers to the disappearance of Trevor Dealey and the mystery of the men in the shadows.